And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And man and woman, being blessed by God, went on to be quite fruitful. They multiplied, they replenished the earth, and in time subdued it. Living outside of the Garden of Eden, man was forced to tap into his and her own creativity. And after thousands upon thousands of years, that level of creativity grew to a point where man created artificial intelligence that on its own has gone on to create as well. Hello, I'm Scott Crawford, and I serve as the president and CEO of Virginia 811. I'll speak a little more about Virginia 811 in relation to a project that we recently completed and are actually taking into a next stage in just a little bit, as it will help highlight some of the themes we'll be exploring in this three-part series that at one level is about artificial intelligence. This series is going to focus on what artificial intelligence is, where are we as a society in regard to using artificial intelligence, what are the limitations of artificial intelligence, but more importantly, it's ultimately a story about creation. It's about a part of man, humans, that strive to create in a manner that very much mimics the book of Genesis and the story of creation. It's a way in which God's creations can now create themselves as we struggle to exist in a very difficult world, more difficult at some times than others. I think we'd all agree. The past year has been pretty difficult. It continues to somewhat be, and hopefully we're seeing a light at the end of that tunnel. But nonetheless, we strive to exist in this post-Edenic world that is riddled with strife, an incredibly difficult, challenging place to be. And yet, through creativity, humans are able to adapt, they're able to improvise, they're able to bring some degree of comfort within this world in very interesting and unique ways. And so this story of creation harkens back to, of course, as I mentioned, the story of creation found in Genesis. And it begs some important questions, especially as we tap into some pretty innovative, creative elements of technology that we grapple with on a daily basis that allow for the development of intelligence, of some level of machine intelligence that starts to interact with humans in amazing ways, in some ways that are just simply astounding and bring an even greater degree of comfort into this world, and in other ways that are quite honestly scary, ways that maybe disrupt some of the peace and harmony we might have found prior to the launching of such technology. And what I would like to explore ultimately in this three-part series is sort of a theological foundation on creation in regard to artificial intelligence, as humans at some level play God and bring about a creation of intelligent entities that can interact with us in unique ways. What does the Bible say? What does the Bible teach us about how we should be good stewards of this creativity, and what is the product of that creativity? And along those same lines, the role that the humanities play in regard to this artificial intelligence that we're grappling to understand. How does poetry, the arts, literature, history all come to bear on business as businesses attempt to use and leverage artificial intelligence to grow, to become more efficient, to possibly open up new markets, ways to increase sales, or whatever may be the objective. there needs to be a balance somewhere in there as we look at a struggle between logic and reason, algorithms driven by math that drive artificial intelligence, and then the passions, the part of man that embrace aesthetics and empathy, compassion, hate, revenge, all of that come together in the soul of humans in a way that creates constant struggle. And so I hope that you'll enjoy this series as we embark upon it today and start to explore some of these themes in greater detail. I hope at the end you're going to find some new ways of maybe looking at the world around you. I hope you'll find a greater appreciation for theology and the humanities as they relate to some of these amazing scientific advances that we're witnessing unfold all around us. Likewise, how theology and the humanities in general need to come to bear on any attempts to develop AI and to help guide those in business and dare I say even politics as we attempt to work together to make our society a better place. And then ultimately to just be able to better understand artificial intelligence and again, what are its limitations? Where are we? Are we in that age that has been envisioned in sci-fi for decades where the computers are about to take over? Or is there still a substantial check on AI and on computers in general and machine learning and so forth? Where maybe it's something more along the lines of yet just another tool that we can use to improve our lives and the world around us. So as we have begun already and with the beginning, in the creation of man, let us continue along this path and see how man has attempted to tap into creativity to influence the world around us. And so, returning to Genesis, the first line specifically, we learn that in the beginning, God created. This is how we are introduced to God in the Bible. He is a creator. God created. We do not know at this point, is he a benevolent God? Is he omnipotent? Is he a force of good or even a force of evil? We have no idea. We just know that God created. This, I think, is an important introduction because as we begin to see the steps God took to create the universe and the world, the heavens and so forth, and eventually man, we learn that then man is made in God's image. And again, outside of the fact that we learn something important in regard to how God created what he created, the order in which the creation unfolds, which we will speak a little more to later, what we see of God at this point is still he's a creator. And if man is made in God's image, there is a suggestion that that spirit of creativity is in essence breathed into man, literally and figuratively. And so we don't have to go too far into man's existence as we start to see evidence of this creation. Historically speaking, looking at our prehistoric ancestors, the first artifacts we find have some level of creativity tied to them, whether it be some sort of tool, a ceremonial tool, or a practical tool of some sort. We see that man had to create. Man had to manipulate the environment in order to survive. But yet, as far back as 40,000 years BC, we have found in these beautiful works of art that are in caves more evidence that this spirit of creativity in human beings went beyond practical uses. They also had an aesthetic quality. They had something that was more than simple practical use. And granted, yes, with the types of cave art that include the handprints that we're looking at now, that include figures, that include other symbols and such that are marked on caves, and even evidence indicates marked through tattoos on human bodies. What we see is probably some spirit of storytelling, some sort of conveyance of communication. But in the hands that we see, I like to think of these as something more than practical application, but something that captures that, again, spirit of creativity in humans, that what we're seeing here in some ways are human beings' first selfies. We see on social media today picture after picture of selfies, somehow giving this message that we presenting ourselves show we are here, that this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm about, this is how I want you to see me. And going as far back as 40,000 years BC, way in the prehistoric period, we see arguably a similar drive among humans to say, I was here. In these cases, by leaving an imprint of the hand on these cave walls. And probably at some level, this connected people as a group, as some sort of culture, as some sort of very primitive society. It united them. Maybe it was a rite of passage, something along those lines. But at some level, it also indicates a level of individualism and a level of creative thought in regard to how I can represent myself in a somewhat abstract way to say I was here. And moving forward, as we look at these now, we can see something that connects us to them beyond just this desire to express ourselves in creative ways. We can learn from these hands by the positioning of the thumb that these are left hands that have been placed up on the cave wall, and then paint applied around them to leave their outlines, suggesting that the majority of our prehistoric ancestors, like us today, were right-handed. They were right-hand dominant. But artificial intelligence, algorithms that have been developed recently, have been able to dive into these images and tell us something else about them. Taking these images, feeding them into an algorithm that can look at image recognition, be able to, through math, through these algorithms, actually read these images and take measurements and do so in a manner faster than humans could do it. We're able to determine an interesting relationship between these hands on their fingers, specifically their ring fingers and their pointer fingers. Those fingers are basically the same size. And this generally indicates a female hand. Women, typically, their ring finger and pointer finger are the same size. If you reach out and look at your hand, you would see as a woman that those two fingers are at the same level. They're almost even. Men, your ring finger tends to be longer than the pointer finger. Now, honestly, how many of you have just done that as you're listening to this? Well, looking at these hands, we see that AI has indicated to us that overwhelmingly the majority of these hands show us that the fingers, these two fingers, are the same size, and therefore, in all likelihood, the hands we're looking at are women's hands. So, again, what does that tell us about this culture? Is it in some primitive way representing gender ideals of some sort that were evident in these prehistoric cultures? Was this something along the lines that early on that women in some way were being a little more tied to the creative side, to the arts, whereas men were possibly outside of the cave hunting for food for the women and such, as the women, due to childbearing necessities, were possibly relegated a little more inside the protection of the cave to take care of the children and such. I don't know. That's, of course, open to interpretation, but it demonstrates for us that we are creative creatures, that this goes back deep into our history, and that through the use of AI, through the use of algorithms, we have been able to create mathematical formulas that have given us new insight on something very, very old. But it doesn't end there, as artificial intelligence, something again that humans have created, has also become a creator. Looking at this cave art from a similar period as the hand prints, we see what appears to be a bull of some sort that someone in the prehistoric period captured on a cave wall. And yet, through the development and creation of algorithms and artificial intelligence, an AI model was created that was able to analyze these images and in turn create its own representation of art inspired by cave art. What you're looking at here is a work of art created by artificial intelligence, not directly by a human. Yes, the human did the programming of the algorithm, but the algorithm itself, the artificial intelligence, was able to in turn create a work of art. Which now that all takes us to this work of art, which was also created by an algorithm. Artificial intelligence created this portrait, which you may remember seeing during the introduction of this session. This particular portrait was the result of an algorithm that was created by an artist group that wanted to see to what level artificial intelligence could create a believable portrait of a human being. They created the algorithm and then basically had the algorithm divided into two different parts, a generator and a discriminator. The algorithm was fed over 15,000 portraits from the 14th century up to the 20th century for the algorithm to basically analyze and learn the various nuances of portraiture spanning across those centuries. The generator would then create a portrait that then the discriminator would have to be fooled into believing it was a real work of art. And so through this trial and error process of the algorithm using what it learns from portraiture, from real portraits, generated possible portraits that then the discriminator either recognized as a fraud, as being something that was generated by the algorithm itself, or that was tricked into thinking that it was an actual portrait created by humans. That whole process led to this particular work of art. Interestingly, the artwork is signed by the algorithm. The algorithm itself that created the work of art is in the bottom right-hand portion of the portrait. So that accounts for some of the blurry quality of this particular portrait. Having it blurred, the generator basically learned it was easier to trick the discriminator. Having these blurred elements to it, basically not having a crystal clear image helped the discriminator not recognize that it was an AI created work of art. And by the way, this work of art went up for auction and it went for over $400,000. It was bought for well over $400,000. So the AI did pretty well on the art market scene. So what a journey. God creates man, man creates AI, AI creates art. But hold on, is it art? Is the work that the AI produces that we see as a work of art truly art? What do we mean by art? Does art simply mean, in some of these cases, paint applied to canvas? Or is there something more to art that the algorithm is missing? Well, before we get into that, which is going to take us back, you got it, to Genesis and the creation story, believe it or not. Before we get into that, let me explain what we mean by AI. We're about 20 some odd minutes into this, and I don't think I've even defined AI yet. And there are probably understandings of AI that are across a very wide spectrum. I fall on various parts of this spectrum at any given time. There are times when I know I frustrate some of my more mathematic-minded folks because I start talking about what AI might be able to do, and only to frustratingly find out that what I'm describing is probably way ahead in the future. And then we have others who are thinking that possibly when they interact with their home pods or talking to Alexis or Siri, that this is some sort of parlor trick of some sort, and it's really not, at any level, some sort of intelligent being as we would define intelligence and apply it to humans. Where are we with AI? How sentient is AI? And should we fear it? Well, I think maybe one place to look is a particular essay that was published not too long ago, and it answers that question. Should we fear AI? Let's look at that for a second. As you can see in the introduction, this article was not written by a human. You guessed it, it was written by AI. In September of 2020, this essay was published in The Guardian, and it was an entire essay, entirely written from scratch by a very powerful language generator, an algorithm, AI, that was given a task to write an essay to relieve any fears that AI is here to hurt us or harm us. The AI makes a good case. It carries forward an argument that clearly indicates it would have no reason to hurt us or to harm us humans, has no interest in doing so, and it's a fun little read to look at AI from the perspective of AI as a language generator allows an algorithm to create text that has meaning and can in some way communicate with us in a manner that it actually takes a position on a topic and defends that position. So according to AI, we have nothing to fear. So that is probably good to hear at one level. But this brings us to an important point about creativity and about the limits of artificial intelligence. As the article indicates at the end in basically a postscript, a footnote actually written by a human to explain how the AI created this particular essay, the postscript clearly indicates that the AI was told it needed to be a 500-word essay. It needed to address this particular topic, taking this position, and it had to indicate certain rules to operate within in regard to how to make that argument. So while it is amazing that a natural language generator, an AI model that can actually create text in a meaningful way, that was able to happen, that was able to create this 500-word essay, but a human hand was directly involved in the creation of the essay. It was giving the AI the ground rules, the topic, and then a switch was hit. Oh, and by the way, the AI created numerous articles which then humans edited and took parts from different essays that all dealt with the same topic and put them together to create the final essay. So it was not as if this AI was turned on, actually scoured the web possibly, and looked at meaningful debates occurring on the web about millions of topics, decided for whatever reason that concerns about AI would be the topic it would write about, would then decide that the essay should probably be 500 words because that's a good size for an essay based on other data research that maybe it did on its own, and then created the actual essay and it was published as such. That didn't happen. A lot of what goes into the creative process was chosen for it by humans and then it simply ran a course that was programmed to create a particular essay. And that's the same deal with the art we looked at. It's not as if the AI thought, I'm going to paint a portrait, and for an aesthetic effect, I'm going to make it a little blurry, just to have a certain possible suggestion that we never can really know anybody too well. So I'm going to add a blurring element to it to hammer that point home. None of that was done. It was told to make a portrait. It was given portraits to work from to create a particular portrait. I'm almost assuredly positive that those portraits were European art. I doubt it was exposed to, say, portraiture in Japanese prints or other cultures that also have flirted with and worked with portraits. So therefore, by the very nature of the project, the AI went into it with bias in the coding that was a reflection of bias on the part of the individuals creating the AI. So there were limits to this. And that's an important thing for us to remember, is that we are not talking about the creation of sentient beings that are thinking for themselves. This is mathematical code created by humans that allows machines to do some amazing things in a time frame that is absolutely astounding. Things that would take humans years, if not even centuries, to accomplish, AI can do in minutes, possibly even seconds. And to highlight that, I want to turn to a project that I was involved in with my position at Virginia 811. It was a grant that I wrote to explore how we could bring at Virginia 811 artificial intelligence into our company to help us accomplish something that's very important to us, and that's auditing locate requests. For those of you who don't know, Virginia 811 is a contact center that serves the state of Virginia, and anyone who is digging in the state of Virginia, whether that be to put flowers in the ground or to build a brand new office building or home, and anything in between, anyone who is breaking ground in Virginia needs to contact 811 so that 811 can notify the underground utilities in that area so that they can get locators to the site in order to paint the ground with color codes, color paint that codes what utilities are buried beneath the ground in order to help those digging to avoid accidentally hitting an underground utility. I don't need to probably highlight too much the danger if someone hits an underground electric line or, heaven forbid, an underground gas line that could cause an explosion. This is very important work, and it allows those digging in the state of Virginia, and that includes homeowners, to be able to do so more safely. In order to do this, the individual who's excavating will submit what we refer to as a ticket, a request, that we then process, and then that is conveyed to the utilities who then send locators to mark the site. Now, in order to do that, the locate request must be clear. It must be very clear, and it must be mapped accurately. So there's a lot of room here for a need for quality assurance and quality control. The information we send on to the utilities needs to be high quality to ensure that utility lines are marked in an accurate manner. So we have a large number of our tickets that are coming to us through web channels. It does not involve calling 811. These are more professional excavators who have worked with us to be trained to use our software, and they create tickets on the computer that are then submitted and we process. What we find is that with anything, there are errors in some of these tickets. And so we worked with Virginia Tech through this grant in order to develop an algorithm that could audit at some level all of these tickets coming through, which, folks, we are talking in the hundreds of thousands a year, in order to try to screen them and identify any kind of odds or chances that a ticket may contain an error. If there is the evidence of risk, the algorithm then sends that ticket to a human who can better audit it and verify whether or not, yes, there is an error and we need to contact the person in order to work it out and fix it, or no, the algorithm was wrong, it's a safe ticket, move on. There is no way possible with the number of individuals working at 811 to be able to do this process through human efforts alone. There are, as I mentioned, hundreds of thousands of tickets coming through a year that we'd have to read through and examine and check in order to ensure that there's high quality. But this algorithm, based on a deep data dive that the algorithm did on our tickets that we had already, over the past several years, had audited and identified as being either accurate or having a risk associated with them, looking at 1.3 million tickets, the algorithm was able to map out complicated relationships between the various variables that go into creating a ticket and look at the risk involved, the weight of the risk involved, if that particular variable was inaccurate, and looking at the probability that a particular variable could be erroneous in relation to all the other variables. It was, again, a process that is mind-boggling, and I do not exaggerate when I say for humans to look at and examine 1.3 million tickets and make the connections that the algorithm was able to do in a matter of weeks as we did this study. It just wouldn't be possible with humans. This was an amazing accomplishment. And what I'm happy to say is that we now currently have an algorithm in place that we are going to be launching this year that will be able to allow 100% of the tickets coming to us through the internet to be audited by an artificial intelligence algorithm that is going to evaluate, based on this criteria, the level of risk every single ticket has, and when it meets a certain threshold, those tickets will seamlessly be delivered within 30 minutes to a human who can verify whether or not the ticket is accurate or inaccurate, and if inaccurate, can now devote time to contacting the caller, the person working on the ticket who submitted the ticket, and work through the challenge, the issue, and correct it. So that way we have higher quality tickets. This is really a very important move for us in damage prevention. So in this case, AI, it was tasked at doing what it can do and can do quite well that humans would be hard pressed to be able to do. But it then allows room for the humans to step in and do what humans can do better than the AI. And that's truly evaluate the nuances that come to bear on that ticket that are difficult to outline in a mathematical equation. And then more importantly, provide better service by reaching out to our stakeholders and talking to them human to human about the potential error and ways to fix it. So this is, again, very exciting to us. And I think the project in and of itself highlights a couple of things for us. It starts to explore the limits of AI and shows that we do not have a sentient entity in place that could not only do the auditing and verify, but then could then seamlessly reach out on its own to a person who submitted an erroneous ticket and have a seamless conversation with them. Now, before we go too far with that, do understand that Google and some other companies are working with voice recognition software that actually is quite intuitive and can have conversations with an individual to a level that I think most of us would be hard-pressed to recognize whether we were talking to a machine or a human. But even that has limitations. And when we're talking about this concept of creativity and AI being able to create, and when we look at AI coming at a problem as Virginia 811 is using it to address the challenge of auditing, I think there's an important question that then comes to bear on all of this, and it goes back to something I mentioned a little bit ago, and that's about art and creativity, and why would some argue that portrait that sold for well over $400,000 is not technically art, that it's missing something. What is that something? And in regard to our own business application of AI, what is it missing? What is that algorithm missing that only humans can step in and do, both in business and in art? And that brings us back to Genesis and the lesson that I referred to earlier about creation. Remember when I mentioned that, what do we know about God as Genesis opens up? All we really know is he creates. And then I mentioned that the way he created everything that he created in that first story of creation that we read in Genesis, it teaches us something very important. And that's what I want to turn to in order to make one final connection to AI in this session. And that looks at the order of creation and what that just teaches us about creation itself and about where we are as humans in this order of creation. When looking at Genesis and the story of creation, the first thing to recognize, though, is that there really are two stories of creation. The first story, where Genesis begins, looks more at the order of creation. What happened on day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then the creation story that follows, the second one, beginning with chapter 2 in Genesis, it looks at more detail surrounding the creation of man and woman. And it arguably sets us up for a better understanding of not only how God created man, but at some level, why humans lead the lives we do, that's riddled with struggle and strife and this existence in which there's conflict, internally and externally. Internally within the soul, externally as we all try to get along or fail to get along. And of course, as we struggle to survive in this world, a post-Edenic world that is defined in many ways by struggle and survival. And so looking first at the first story of creation, it's important to identify that there's reason behind the order. The first 3 days all involve the creation of things that lack motion, that do not move. The last 3 days increasingly build on movement. Everything created in the last 3 days have some level of movement. By day 4, we have the creation of the universe, the planets. They move, but they cannot change their direction. The movement is, as we now know, based on gravitational pull and relationships, or unequal relationships between heavenly bodies and all of this that provide motion. Then by day 5, we see the creation of animals that have motion, but now can change the direction and the way they move. They can move in any manner that their instincts and that the environment suggests to them that they need to move. Just watch your cat laying nicely on the floor and come up behind it, and if you clap your hands, it's probably going to decide very quickly to jump and possibly run. And then based on the environment, walls, doors, and so forth, it's going to make up its mind to change direction in order to avoid hazards. Then with day 6, we see the creation of man. And of course that then includes both man and woman. But there's not much detail given as to how humans are created, but rather just that they are created last. And in this hierarchy of movement, you now have the creation of humans who not only can move, who not only can change their direction, but they can change who they are. They can move in some ways at a metaphysical level in regard to their ability to consciously change and move their behaviors. And so thus we learn in the first story of creation that humans are at the apex of creation and hierarchically speaking are at the top of everything that is created. And much of this revolves around this higher level of movement and motion. So then we move into the second story, where we learn that God from dust forms man and then breathes a spirit into man. This doesn't happen with the other animals. This is a more advanced level of creation, in that man is made from this world, but yet is given a spirit, is given a part of God. There's a part of God in us, in his breath, that then is breathed into us. In that sense, and then with the fall, that we start to see that there's a conflict within the structure of the soul. At one level, man is biological. He is an animal. And of course, I'm referring to both men and women here, more the universal sense of man. Humans are part of this world. They're tied to this world. Their bodies chain them to this world. And by necessity, they have biological needs that must be met in order to continue to survive. But at another level, they do have a spirit. They have a level of understanding of what should be done and possibly why it should be done. A notion of the good life, that reason and logic, a higher level of thinking, is able to possibly lead humans along one course, but then constantly they struggle with the passions that are all around them in this world. And if you just think of the 7 deadly sins, why are they deadly? These are deadly sins because they tap into the various passions that are all directly tied to this world, such as gluttony and lust, wrath, revenge, and anger, all of that are tied to this world, that can consume your soul and cause an individual to do horrible things that logic and reason would, and the knowledge of the good life would, lead them to the conclusion they shouldn't be doing that, but yet the passions rule over this soul. And so at any given time, we're all somewhere on this, again, a spectrum between the good and the bad, the wisdom of what is good, what is right, which we may see as logic and reason, coming up against the passions, illogical behavior, unreasonable behavior that is driven by the world in which we live and many of our biological needs. As an example, of course, to eat, we must eat. But logic and reason and what we know we should do would mean that we should have a balanced diet, not eat too much, eat in a manner that is healthy. But yet our passions many times will come to bear on us, and we go for what tastes really good, and maybe we eat too much. And of course, that's any of us falling on that spectrum at any given time. But if all of a sudden that consumes your soul to where an individual will do any and everything they can to have that need met, including lying and possibly hurting other people to get to food, then that's gluttony. And now food has become that person's idol, in a sense, and has consumed the soul. The passions win out in that case. And so it's this constant struggle, a struggle that could be articulated as an anxious middle, the metaxy, where we're constantly, on a daily basis, fighting these battles, these demons within, as we strive to keep our passions at bay and keep them in check. And at some level, arguably, that's what becomes a foundation upon which much of the arts rest. It's that struggle that is then produced or allowed to produce aesthetically engaging and pleasing, even disturbing images and thoughts within writing and so forth, that give art its essence. And it's this struggle that's obviously and arguably not as evidently present in artificial intelligence. And so, in that manner, creation, these two creation stories, teach us a little more about human intelligence and what drives it, and what is currently lacking in artificial intelligence and is going to be incredibly difficult to produce in artificial intelligence, to allow artificial intelligence to grapple with these struggles in a true intimate manner internally, and then on its own create some sort of representation and reflection of that struggle, and do so in a meaningful way where the art at some level then has a soul. So at some level, in all likelihood, AI will never be able to fully develop in a sentient way as described in Genesis in relation to the human soul. AI is driven by algorithms, it's driven by math, it's driven by logic and reason as programming dictates. It does not understand deeper relationships, emotions, and so forth that come into conflict at some level with logic and reason in order to create that level of struggle that humans experience, and arguably that in essence comes through in art at a deep level that allows art to reflect something more than simply placing paint on a canvas, or in the form of poetry, words on a written page, and so forth. And so this is, kind of an interesting way to start, where we are seeing that, as God created man, and as man creates artificial intelligence, each step removed from perfection, from God, there's a devolution of sorts. And this is a theme that is as ancient as much of when the Bible was finally put down in writing and so forth, thousands of years ago, over 2,500 years ago, in the writings of Plato. And that's something we're going to look at next week, is what does classical philosophy add to in regard to our understanding of Genesis, and in regard to this concept of a soul, and how that may or may not relate to AI. I think this is going to be a fun journey as we continue to dive into AI and look at some of its applications, and how that plays through in regard to a need for an understanding in theology and the humanities to really sort of help guide us as we interact with AI and as we continue to develop it. So thanks for hanging in there today. I look forward to seeing you in a week. We're going to have an email set up so that you can communicate with me during these sessions and ask questions. I'm hoping we can work in some sort of tea or coffee time at the end of this, where we can all meet through a video conferencing platform of some sort and be able to discuss some of these ideas live and with each other in a safe way as we continue to watch this COVID pandemic unfold. I do hope everyone is safe and keeping well. Ultimately we all need to fall back on our faith as we struggle through these times. So thank you all for joining, and I look forward to our next session.